So what's, just getting back now to your practice in cardiology, and it sounds like you have a career that involves a lot more than just practicing cardiology. What what sorts of what sort of group do you belong to? What sort of practice do you have?
So I started out in academics. I worked 15 years at the West Roxbury VA and then the Brigham system. And I was assistant chief of medicine there, so I was involved with education. I also did research. I actually did some research before that. I developed the first neonatal apnea monitor, and I participated in the first wireless transmission of EKGs because we wanted people who had heart attacks to be able to walk around or go out running or whatever. So that was in like 1970, and then in the late 70s I worked in the two-dimensional echo and so forth. So I got to play engineer and do that sort of stuff. And then, so I did some research in medicine and large trials and so forth. And after 15 years, the government decided to downsize the VA, so we lost 25 physicians in 2 years to other academic centers. So our staff hematologist became chief at Cleveland Clinic. I mean, these were excellent people who were working in Boston for lower salaries because they wanted to be in Boston, but challenged with finally making a decision to leave. So I left and went on staff with Beth Israel and Boston Medical Center while also starting my practice. And so we grew from a 2-physician cardiology group to an 8-physician cardiology group, which basically allows our young people to spend at least a day in a teaching hospital and the rest of the time with us, some people a day and a half. So it allows us to recruit better people. But they all have a Massachusetts connection because the salaries in Massachusetts are lower. So you never get anybody who has no relatives in the state. Okay. So those are 2 things that we use to build an excellent group.
And this is a private practice?
Correct.
Okay. And so you maintain an office in a suburb?
We maintain an office in South Weymouth. I helped build a cath lab at Quincy Hospital. We built a cath lab at South Shore, and we now do as many angiopresses as the Brigham and Mass General. So we basically got people who were already academically qualified to join our group, and then we opened a lab, and we were under the scrutiny of the state. First did our caths, and then we did heart attacks and had good data. And then we wanted to do elective angioplasty. They challenged us, so they made us do a study for 3 years. And 2 patients were done by us, and the other was done in town. Now, the problem was we were also doing the procedure in town, so it's like you're a plumber in Weymouth and a plumber in Boston. I always said that I got a lot smarter when I drove the 10 miles to Boston than I was. But, so we were able to beat all those statistics, establish our program. So we now have, and we also opened an electrophysiology lab. I had done some electrophysiology, pacemakers and defibrillators and that sort of thing.
So what patient mix, what kinds of problems do you take care of?
So I did invasive cardiology, I did non-invasive cardiology, nuclear. I did a little bit of everything because as new things came along, there's a certain time when you could learn how to do those things.
Okay.
But now everybody's sort of focused, so ultrasound, people only do ultrasound, they don't do invasive procedures. So I was a dinosaur, I did a little bit of everything. So it was more fun to be able to do all that and to teach. And so I had kind of a unique practice in being able to get to do all those things.
So you're seeing people with angina, you're seeing people with heart failure, you're seeing people with heart attacks.
Right, and in the beginning I even did primary care because we all did some primary care, and then but we were attracting the sickest people, so they finally told us, you guys need to get out of primary care. Your data looks good for cardiology, but it doesn't look good but I had done 25 years of ER work. I worked with Judd Klein and with Alan Woodward at Emerson, and we had a business that had 100 critical care specialists from the top teaching hospitals that covered 20 hospitals in the suburbs, ICUs at night and so forth.
So this is, you've alluded to an awful lot here. So when did you get your MD degree?
1973.
And from there you went into emergency medicine?
No, I finished my training. I graduated in 73, finished my residency in 75, took 2 years off and ran an electronics company in Waltham and did consulting for the NIH on we did sudden infant death and this apnea monitoring and so forth.
Sure.
And then I went back and did cardiology in 77 to 79. Then I came out and joined the Brigham staff and the VA staff. And then someone that started this whole idea of hospitals can have better equipment, more CAT scanners if they have 2 doctors 24/7. So besides the emergency room doctor, we became that second doctor covering the ICUs, which allowed most of the community hospitals to upgrade their equipment and services they offered. So we were basically the early hospitalists, but we were basically intensivist hospitals. So most of the people who work with us are all CEOs of hospitals and heads of big drug companies and so forth now, because they were all very bright people in academics, and we were all trying to make a living because salaries were low in Boston and so on. So there's 2 major pharmaceutical heads, heads of at least 2 major hospitals in Boston.
And you've stuck with the clinical part. You haven't gone down the administrative path so much. You basically.
Well, I was assistant chief of medicine, and then I was on a number of committees and things at our hospital, and then about 10 years ago, I was elected to the board of Coveris, which is a medical malpractice company. So that I'm now an officer in that company, on the board of that company. So I've been involved with that side of medicine. I've been on the policy commission for 4 or 5 years, and been in the organized medical staff at the AMA for about 10 years. So that's a place where a lot of these issues dealing with physicians, practices, and governance. But I tried to take a lot of initiatives there. And again, the AMA was slow. Like I took an initiative to get physicians in the community who were in different practices on the same software so they would be interoperable. Sure. So we did 200 physicians on the South Shore in 7 different practices, 10 practices actually. And I took that model to the AMA and said, look, this is a good model. This will keep people from being consolidated. And it took me a year to get them to understand what I was doing. I had to talk to them on the phone for 2 months, for an hour or so a week to explain what we did. We were looking for them to help us with the legal work, but by the time they got it done, we had already done it all. So we formed, so everyone who was on that system owned shares in this limited liability corporation. And if you left the group, you owned your data. If you work for one of these large organizations and you leave, they own all your data. So I warned some physicians. So some physicians were lucky enough to pay for their own software, and when they left some of these big systems, they have all their quality metrics and so forth for years in their own hands. Major issue for doctors.
So getting back to the clinical part of your practice, how have you seen the treatment of some of the more common problems that you deal with evolving, and how have the results improved?
So going back to the beginning of my practice, it's like caveman. You give a few aspirin when you have a heart attack, to the fact that we rush to the hospital and open your artery as quickly as possible. It's light years away, and it changes every 3 months. You know, the medications we change, give before and after an angioplasty change. Working with pacemakers were that big. Defibrillators, they're now this, the miniaturization of digital, electronics. My master's thesis in college was a digital electronic heart monitor. It was as big as that table, and now it's a chip that big. I was always involved with technology, but to give you an example of the electronic, I used 5 different electronic medical records in a day. I used radiology, cath, echo, my office system, and the hospital system. 5 different softwares that I'd have to move back and forth and faxing for a day. That's crazy.
It's crazy on many levels, yes. So you're working hard to try to
keep up. You get used to it after a while, but it's really, when you think about it.
That's the state of things at the moment.
Right.
Yeah, and you've put a lot of your energy into trying to bring some sense to this, because you have a lot of deep knowledge as to what this means. So let's talk a little bit. You've alluded to an engineering background. Tell me a little bit about that.
So I started out at Brown University I came there with no physics background, because I went to an inner city high school, which wasn't that great, but I had a few teachers who were excellent, who made me come to school early. They gave me some math exams and things and challenged me. And they made me take the college boards as a sophomore in high school. So I got high enough to get into college at that point, and they said, you need to do this every year and take all these things. So by the time I was a senior, I got grades high enough to go off with a scholarship to an Ivy League school. I played, soccer, basketball, and baseball, so I had some sports scholarships. But my mother had gone to the same high school, and nobody had gone to an Ivy League school since she graduated in 1939. So in 1963, 20 some odd years had gone by. So it was a challenge, but and our engineering program was headed by the number 2 man in Germany who worked with Werner von Braun on the V-2 rockets, Dr. Mader. So he was a tactician, and only 37 of us out of 120 finished the program. It was a pretty grueling program.
And this was at what college?
Brown University.
Mm-hmm.
So I stayed for a master's year, but I got offered a job. I got interested in biomedical engineering, and I got offered a job at the NIH in the biomedical engineering branch, because one of the kids in my dorm, his father worked there, and I told him I was a biomedical engineer. There weren't many in those days. It was 1965, so they called and offered me a job, and I got to work with some really super engineers who were doctors.
Wow.
So we were the support group for the NIH for various different studies and so forth. And we were working on artificial hearts. The cow would be alive when you went home that night. It'd be dead the next morning from black. But so I got that, and I rode the bus with the deans of medical schools, and they said, you don't want to get a PhD, you want to go to medical school. So in that last year, I last minute applied to medical schools, all of whom told me to get lost because I hadn't even taken biology, but I had all the science. So I took the biology, and I took the anatomy, and I took the organic chemistry and all that. And so in the spring of my 5th year, my grades and things came back to the schools. So then 3 schools called me up and invited me for interviews in July. So I flew to Boston in July and got into medical school and started medical school in September. But they didn't know what to do as an engineer in those days. Now they grab everything so technical. But in those days, the lower schools didn't understand it. The more schools that had a reputation that they weren't worried about, admitting somebody with a different background, were interested. So that's
So
how
where'd you go to med school?
Tufts.
And what was medical school like?
Different. It wasn't as hard as engineering school was. But so the first year I went to school full time, and I spread the last 3 years over 4 years because I worked part time at Hewlett Packard. So
During medical school, you were working at
so
Hewlett Packard?
I would, second year first year in the spring I had some of the anatomy and other courses, so I would take the bus to the outskirts of Boston and hitchhike to Waltham to get to my job. So I did the summer and helped that on the wireless transmission of EKGs, and they asked me to stay on, and I told them I was a medical student. I had to go back to work. So they made me the only part-time employee in the whole corporation. Hewlett approved me to work. So I worked part-time for them for 6 years, and I was able to, so I would go to school for 3 months, and then I'd work for 3 months, and that sort of thing. So I did, being guilty, and you know how medicine is, I did an extra medicine rotation and extra time, just because you feel like you're not keeping up. So by the time I started my internship, I'd already covered for an intern for 3 months. Somebody got sick, and so I was more experienced at that point. So it was helpful to be treated as a grown-up in the afternoon. I was doing $1 million project, and $1 million in 1960 and 1970 was a lot of money. So, but in medical school, you're here.
Yes.
And so it was interesting. But medical school was, our class voted to go on strike after the students were shot at Kent State and Jackson State, and they all voted to do that. And not take finals, and then 80% of the class took finals and didn't do that. The dummy here ran the strike center, but I did get to fly to Washington with all the top attendings from the top, because they wanted to stop the war. So they chartered a plane, and they wanted a student to go. So we went, and we walked all through Congress trying to talk to people about the war.
Wow, the Vietnam War, yes.
And they all said, well, are you from the AMA? Are you from the Mass Medical Society? Who are you?
Yeah.
And so all these very famous doctors were highly offended that nobody knew who they were.
Yeah.
So on the way back from Washington, they were asking how they could disrupt the Mass Medical Society meeting to draft a resolution to stop the war. So they got radicalized by the fact that they had no power, which was a very interesting commentary on why people become more active. But it was fascinating to see. I mean, all the names in the hospitals in Boston with the floors, these were the doctors that I was on this plane. If that plane had crashed, Boston would have been in big trouble.
So you finished medical school. You did a couple of years or so as an internship and early training,
Right.
and then from there you
Then I took a position as an attending a junior attending at the West Roxbury VA and the Brigham.
and that's where you got your experience in the emergency room. And
Then,
in
yeah,
terms
then
of
I
care.
worked in the emergency room as well as running this critical care business. So I did ER for 25 years too. I liked the action of the ER, so it was fun to, and I was allowed, because I had done it for a long time, because they were getting it to board certification, but because I had so much experience and I was a cardiologist, it was useful to have that kind of a person in your ER.
And then you went back and you did a cardiology fellowship.
No, I did a cardiology fellowship first, so
Yeah.
I came right back from the 2 years off to do a cardiology fellowship.
Yep.
And during that time, I started to, lived in Concord. I decided I might as well find out what the local hospital was like. So I worked with Judd in the ER, and then I worked at a few other. Well, I had privileges at something like 8 hospitals, and 3 academic hospitals and 7 community hospitals. Because we had to do quality control for the programs that we ran to make sure that the people practicing were up to stuff and so forth, just to understand.
So I think one of the unique things you're bringing out here is that you started as an engineer, basically. Your perspective, your training was as an engineer, and you brought that with you into medicine. And I'm curious to know, it's obvious to me how that has benefited your career and the profession. But tell me your perspective as to how that made you different and how that helped.
I think, well, it was tremendous background. So our program, you studied all phases of engineering. In your 4th year and 5th year, you specialized, but you learned fluid mechanics, you learned mechanical stuff, you learned and applied math, because Thomas Watson had graduated from the school, so he donated a computer lab so you could do all you wanted with computers. So it was tremendous background. I mean, you didn't memorize; you could you could derive an equation. And so
Right.
medical school was more memory, as was organic chemistry, which I tried to audit first, and then I took the course after blowing it, and I had the highest grade in the school, but it's because I had the time to sit down and memorize it. But at the time, I was taking quantum mechanics and complicated things. So medicine is difficult, but it's a lot of time, I think. Fortunately for me, there was a group of students we had 20 women, 5 blacks, and 5 hippies. And so we became a pack, and we studied together because we were looked at as people who shouldn't have been there. The other people resented us as being different from the typical med student of the day. So it's interesting to see this classes I'm on the board at Tufts, to see the classes be more than half women now.
Do you feel that held you back in any way?
It was challenging because there were people who thought that, even some of the attendings thought, there were supposed to be 5 disadvantaged students admitted, and turned out that the 5 blacks were not the 5 disadvantaged students, but we bore the stigma of that.
Sure.
But 3 of us were late career choices because we had advanced degrees in other areas.
Yeah.
So it was by the time we were seniors, we had overcome that. And one guy went on to become a top researcher at MGH, one of the top ophthalmologists, and another is a teacher at a Mississippi. And 2 of the guys who couldn't be admitted to Ole Miss are professors at in Mississippi now. So but that was a long run. It was much harder because of the attitudes, toward us being there.
Do you feel that's changed at all?
I think it's still challenging. We put on a course called Reality Medicine in the spring for the students, but primarily for minority students and people from other countries. And some of the same challenges are still there 40 years later. It's disturbing to see that the challenges for kids who are different are a problem. So we try to orient them. We have students from all 3 medical schools come together to discuss issues. But the same issues that we dealt with as students are still there. So,
Do you, and yet you've achieved an enormous amount of success.
yes, I think that you have to have luck, and you have to work hard. I mean, when I flew up for my interview at Tufts, there was a science magazine, and it was about DNA. So I read the whole article, and when I got to my interview, they said, "So, Mr. Dunlap, tell us about DNA." So I gave a lecture on DNA because I spent an hour and a half reading about it on the way. So I mean, like, how lucky is that? I mean, that you would just, you know, I was no smarter or dumber after that, but from their point of view, I was a genius because I just, ran down DNA for them. So, yeah, I still think it's. I mean, I did a lecture on academic advancement and careers in Boston. Just looked at the data from the schools, and it's still quite challenging for minorities and women and so forth in Boston. Even this was 2 years ago. I mean, just looking at the statistics.
So you also point out the fact that one of your high school teachers saw something in you and, gave you some additional coursework, gave you some additional encouragement. Were there others who played a role as you were growing up in allowing you to set lofty goals?
Yeah, probably my mother, but I think probably we had teachers. My math teachers. I ended up going to college with that same math teacher. I went to college with her son and my fourth grade math teacher from elementary school's son. So we were friends at college, but it was unlikely that they had been to the best prep schools and high schools in New Jersey, and I had been to. It was a fun place, but it wasn't ranked among the best schools. So. There were definitely some people who were committed. There were a lot of teachers who were just putting in their time.
Sure.
And so that the problem was, would you make the extra effort to challenge the kids who you thought could do a little bit more? There are not many people who are prepared to do that.
And your mother had some
my mother was
high hopes for you?
Bill Belichick school. Faint praise, high standards. You got A's. Oh, that's fine.
Yeah.
But so I think that kind of motivates you to achieve. She didn't make a big deal out of it the way some parents do.
But was there an expectation that you would go to college?
I from an early age decided I was going to go to college. So I had my heart set on getting a scholarship. So
Sure.
I mean, I enjoyed playing sports, but I was 5'5", 110 in high school, and I graduated at 6 feet 190. So when I tried to go out for football, they said, if somebody dies, we'll give you a uniform. So I played soccer for something to do, and then I started growing, and I played basketball and baseball, and and I knew that I needed a scholarship, so I needed to have the grades and to be able to get into those. I had a plan, so I got a number of scholarships.
You had a plan.
A number of scholarships. And,
you had a plan.
Yeah.
That's terrific. Well, this has been an incredibly interesting conversation. We've talked about how the health system has evolved and your perspective on it, which is very deep. I think you have a deep understanding of a lot of the critical issues regarding health policy, electronic records, organizing people and trying to empower the profession of medicine. And also just a very interesting look at your career, how it evolved from engineering into cardiology and the like. So that's terrific, as well as hearing some about your childhood. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about
I think
today?
I truly love teaching. So the hardest thing about private practice was I missed luckily for me, the first 10 years I spent a day at Boston Medical Center and a day at Beth Israel, so I continued to teach.
Yeah.
So, because that was something that was hard for me to give up. If I could have afforded it, I would have continued teaching. But that's a familiar story. I mean, I think people are paid better now. It's a little more competitive, but they also have to do more clinical medicine than many people in some of these institutions have to do. So I liked probably working with the young people the most. That's probably, it's fun to go to meetings and see people that you taught be chief of medicine or chief of cardiology somewhere. So that's kind of neat. But
excellent. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us.